May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. School's about to start, so I've got a pop quiz for you all just to get you warmed up. But no shame if you don't know the answer. If you don't know the answer, this is just your fun moment to discover something new about St. John's. So if you walked into the sanctuary through those doors this morning, what words did you walk under? Thank you, Deacon. Exit, yeah. But if you walked in, let's try it one more time. If you walked in, given to hospitality. Did you know that? Look on your way out. You'll have to turn around because it says you walk in. For my very first encounter with St. John's, and I hope this may have been true for you, it was clear that being given to hospitality were not just words that were carved over those front doors, but it's a way of life here at St. John's. That this parish has been and that we continue to strive to be shaped and formed by this commitment. Being given to hospitality, or the words, all are welcome, are ones that I encounter, and I might encourage you to consider encountering, both as an inspiration, something that brings that sense of, yes, that's what I want, all are welcome, but also to live in that tension of them always being a challenge or a question. If all are welcome, do we stop there or do we keep asking, what does that mean? Who that we aren't thinking of are we actually not as welcoming to as we would like to be? What does given to hospitality mean here and now, in this time, in this era, in this community? That these are guiding principles that we don't just put on our website and across over our doors, but that we are living and engaging with each and every day. For me, and maybe for you, the Eucharist or Holy Communion is closely coupled with this principle of hospitality, of welcome. It's that sacramental touchstone that keeps both the blessing and that challenging tension of being given to hospitality and being part of God's full welcome actively engaged in my heart and I hope yours, heart and minds. Because Eucharist, as a touchstone, takes us right back to Jesus as we come around the table to celebrate a meal that Jesus invites us to do in remembrance of him. Jesus spoke the words that we invoke in the Eucharistic prayers at what is known as the Last Supper. It's that meal that he shared before he was crucified. It's that meal that Holy Communion arose from. When we come around the table and we remember those last hours and days of Jesus' life on earth, we remember the life, the death, and the eventual resurrection of Jesus, that we remember that bread and cup broken and blessed and passed and eaten together. So when we come around the table each week and we engage in this holy sacrament, it's an opportunity to be inspired and challenged to look back and ask ourselves, in the institution of this meal, how was Jesus given to hospitality? What did welcome look like at that Last Supper? It shouldn't surprise us, if we've been hanging out with Jesus for very long, that that meal was no exception to Jesus's turning upside down by eating with all different kinds of people kind of meal. If we think about it for a minute, we'll probably get there, but I don't know about you, but at times this meal in Christian tradition, maybe in our traditions, maybe in our even own heads, and our collective imagination, in artworks and legends, has become this very pretty little picture. You think about maybe the Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper with these 12 well-behaved disciples all neatly gathered on one side of the table so that the picture worked better. And they're just having this very nice, proper meal. I don't think that might be actually what happened. Let's explore what it might have been like. Because our stories, like our today's gospel, should tip us off that Jesus' way was not usually a proper dinner party. That this meal had become, which has become reenacted in specific ways, was likely to be a much more alive and messy and overflowing with all the wrong people than some of our rituals and art might be telling us. This meal was much more likely like this feast Jesus describes in the parable this morning. A table that was filled with unlikely people, the ill and the lame, the disenfranchised, and those who wouldn't have been invited to the table, the ones who couldn't spend Passover with their own families, and the ones who didn't have family to spend it with. In our gospel reading today, Jesus was having dinner with some Pharisees. Now, Pharisees were religious people who distinguished themselves in many of these stories by having strict observance of traditional and written law, and were commonly thought to maybe have some attitudes towards a more superior sanctity, that they are the ones who usually knew what was the right way to do it. I have to say, sometimes I identify a little too closely with the Pharisees. Maybe there's some part of you that does that as well. So when Jesus noticed that some of the Pharisees had sat at the head of the table at this dinner party, vying for the best spots, he told this parable. He said, when you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down at the place of honor in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host. He also said to the one who invited him, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers, your sisters, your siblings, or your relatives, or your rich neighbors in case that they might invite you in return. So don't do it for what you're going to get out of it, or that you might be repaid. It's not about that reciprocity in that way. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. Jesus is reminding us that when we open up our hearts, our homes, our table, even our minds, that we are not to invite those people who will invite us back or who agree with us or are going to make it be just comfy and just how we want it to be, but instead to invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. Invite the people around our tables that we might not have dinner with otherwise, for whatever reason. The ones that we don't know yet. The ones who usually don't get invited over for dinner. Invite the parts of ourselves around this table that we usually like to keep at home, that don't like to get dressed up in our Sunday best, those parts of ourselves that maybe we struggle with, those human tendencies that we're embarrassed to admit, that those pieces too are invited around the table, that all of ourselves and all of humanity are welcome here. Because when we come to Holy Communion, we're offered this invitation not only to remember the particularity of Jesus in the bread and the cup, but to remember what kind of table Jesus was around when he instituted this sacrament. To remember how our values of hospitality and welcome emanate out from God's table, and that that table can continue to shape us and change us. Throughout Christian history, and remember, Christian history includes human history. I just want to pause on this for a second. When we think about Christian history, we have to remember that humans were involved as well as God. And then when we look at how we have been a force for good and a force for harm, that we remember that the harm is usually the human part. So throughout Christian history, the sacrament of communion or Eucharist has been practiced. And sometimes, many times, this is a sacrament of welcome, of healing. But I think it's important to remember that in times and places in ourselves and within our own community, it can also be used as a sacrament of barrier. There's a history of precipitating barricades around the table and barring people from the table based on their profession of faith or denomination or moral standing or difference or sexual orientation or race or class or opinion, this table and the humans who gather around it has been used to both include and to exclude. I think it is important as we explore the theology of the table to be honest about that. Because we, as humans, with our best hopes and values for who we hope to be as a community, can use our sacraments, our attitudes, our very beings to both include and exclude, sometimes knowingly, often unknowingly. So that as we look at our theology of the table, that we name when is it being a table that is God's table, that table of welcome, that table of being given to hospitality, and when are we consciously or unconsciously engaging in those patterns of hierarchy or division or exclusion. That a theology of the table as a place of community and reconciliation and coming together is one that breaks down the barriers that are placed between us living together as a human family. And so I invite us to go back again to that Last Supper and to look at and wonder, what was that table like? A number of years ago, I did an in-depth reading of the Gospel of Mark. Now, I recognize our Gospel reading today is Luke, but a number of years ago, I read all through Gospel of Mark, so you're going to get that today. I did not read all the Gospel of Luke this last week. I wish that was the case. That did not happen. But a number of years ago, I read this question through the lens of the Gospel of Mark of who was at the Last Supper. I wanted to know who was there. Because it wasn't sitting well, this kind of just the 12 disciples in this nice dinner party. So I asked that question because it's followed quickly by this question of who was around our table. So here's what I found in the Gospel of Mark. Who was at the Last Supper? The simple answer is the disciples. Now, that is not just the 12 disciples, which you will quickly find out if you read the Gospel of Mark or the other three Gospels. The disciples, according to the Gospel of Mark, the disciples are mentioned 53 times. And as I meditated on those 53 mentions of the disciples, there are a few themes that showed up. The first thing I noticed is that 20 of these mention something to do with eating. So 20 of the times that the disciples are mentioned in the Gospel of Mark, they're eating. First, it talks about who they ate with: Jesus, disciples, tax collectors, sinners. It talks about the breaking of eating laws, which we talked about last week in our gospel, picking grain on the Sabbath, eating with unwashed hands. We've got two miraculous feeding stories. Those feeding stories show up in all four Gospels, by the way. We've got the disciples who forgot the bread when they're out in the boat, and then we have this story of the Last Supper. Now, with the exception of the forgetting the bread on the boat and the grain fields, all the other instances took place with three key players in these stories. One was Jesus, one was the disciples, and one was crowds of people. So this led me to my next noticing was that Jesus certainly had a select following of people who traveled with him regularly. And then there were crowds in each town. But the disciples were that community of followers of Jesus. They were distinct from the crowd that they would meet in each town, but it was certainly not as selective as the 12 disciples. The disciples seem to refer to a group of people, the people who were following Jesus kind of day in and day out, who had left their homes and families for this time to follow Jesus. Now, it's hard to know because we weren't there, but I can imagine from all we know about Jesus and this countercultural gospel that the kinds of people who were following Jesus, and we know specifics of some of them, were people like the woman at Bethany who poured all that she had of her oil over Jesus's feet. We can imagine Mary and Martha. We can imagine the types of people who were gathered around Jesus, who were following him, these disciples. And so when we say, who was at the Last Supper, the disciples, the painting that we used to know might start to fade. It was useful in its acceptable and predictable ways, but it's faded, and on the canvas there are new strokes appearing. And it's a much more messy, crowded, confusing, boisterous crowd. that the room is overflowing with women and men, young and old, able-bodied and slow, creaking bodies, those who lived lives of luxury before they took their sandals to the dusty streets to follow this Christ, right alongside those who are so glad that the bread was multiplied because hunger had been their way of life. This Last Supper, this gathering around the table, it seems like may have been a much more human, eclectic crew than we might like to think. And to me, that is good news. That is the gospel, because it means that this tradition that we continue to enact today was founded with a wonderful mix of people, whole humans bringing themselves to this table, gathering together and asking Jesus, what does it mean to follow you? Before that bread was even broken and the wine was passed. The thing about this table, my friends, is it's not our table. It's not our table. It's God's table. It's the table that Jesus gathered people around and keeps gathering people around today. Our job is to keep showing up at it. Some of our jobs is to keep raising that bread and telling the story. All of our jobs is to continue to receive it and to be changed by it, to be surprised by what it is that God is teaching us, to be surprised by how it is that we are being called to be those disciples of Christ. We gather around this table because it, I hope, feeds us and nurtures us. But I invite us to also gather around it to be challenged, to wonder, to ask who and how and what and where are we being called to be changed so that God's welcome, God's hospitality is more and more experienced here. As we go into this fall season together, we're going to be prayerfully looking at how we as a parish are moving forward with God. That this call to follow God, to love neighbor as a community comes from our interaction with this table. It comes from longing to be together, a community that follows Jesus in these Jesus kind of ways. After we gather for worship in a few weeks on September 11th, the beginning of our program year, we're going to have what we're calling an all-parish convocation. We're going to gather right here in this room around this table to ask the questions of how and why are we, as St. John's, loving God and loving neighbor. I encourage each and every one of you to be there, because I don't want to just see the 12 disciples. This is not just for the vestry. This is for all the followers of Christ, whether this is your first time here today or whether you have been coming here for most of your life. Your voice is needed. Your listening, your life experience is needed, because we all are discerning God's call for this parish together. All the disciples of Christ. We are listening and learning and exploring who is it that God is calling us to be. And so I encourage you to prayerfully prepare for those conversations together and to be here and take part. Because I believe that we are called. And I think this church truly is and can continue to be part of God's kingdom. God's kingdom in a way that the prophetic words of Rachel Held Evans describes. She writes, "This is what God's kingdom is like. A bunch of outcasts and oddballs gathered at a table, not because they are rich or worthy or good, but because they are hungry, because they said yes, and there's always room for more." Amen. As we enter into the holy silence, I invite you to ponder, who are the people or the areas, what are those things that you have consciously or unconsciously been excluding from God's table? And invite God to open up in us a place for greater welcome, knowing that we certainly entertain angels unaware. Amen.